First, I want to welcome everyone here today. I'm Marie Concannon of the University Libraries. I would like to introduce Deb Ward, Interim Vice Provost and University Librarian for the University of Missouri Libraries.
Hello, greetings everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you to our first book talk for the year, based on the book The Ioway in Missouri, authored by Greg Olson. The university libraries are happy to co-host this event in collaboration with the University of Missouri Press, which publishes Mr. Olson's work. This is only the first program in this collaborative series, so do watch for additional programs between the libraries and the U Press in the future. I'm Deb Ward. I'm Interim Vice Provost and University Librarian for the University of Missouri Libraries. And Thanksgiving was just last week. And like many of you, I've been thinking a lot about Native American history. The land we inhabit, the soil that produces our food, the waterways from which we draw life, all were home to other peoples in days before our time. Who were these people? How did they live? What did they consider sacred? And where did they go? What can we learn about them and their culture that will give us a sense of how to honor their relationship to us today? I used to live on a farm in Eastern Kentucky. It was my in-laws' farm where I lived for many years, and there was a Native American burial mound on the property. It inspired in me a deep curiosity about the people who had called the same place home hundreds of years before. Well, my father-in-law did his PhD work in entomology at the University of Kentucky, and he had a way of connecting with people from all walks of life and maintained lifelong relationships with them. He had many conversations with people about the land, the counties, the rivers, and its peoples. And one day, a group of researchers from UK asked him about the mound that they had heard him mention that's on his property. They wanted to excavate the mound to discover what they could about it. Well, my father-in-law very kindly replied that he had seen reports and photos of such excavations, and he believed that this one would be very much the same. Let the sacred dead remain undisturbed, is what he told them. And when he told us that evening at the dinner table about the call he had received that day, I was so proud of his respect for these people about whom we know so little. So I began to read about the topic. I just wanted to know more. And I hope that today I can add to my knowledge of America's Native peoples. And through this virtual event, we and the University of Missouri Press are affirming our mutual commitment to the book as a medium for fostering learning, expanding intellectual engagement, and deepening our commitment to understanding cultures other than our own. And with that, I'd like to introduce our colleague, David Rosenbaum, Director of the University of Missouri Press, who will share more on this fascinating product of the U Press about the Ioway. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Deb. Again, I'm Dave Rosenbaum, the Director of the University of Missouri Press, co-sponsor with the University Libraries of these book talks. I'm here today to introduce and welcome Greg Olson, but before I do that, I wanted to share my thoughts very briefly on the importance of his book and this topic. Most of you know that next year is the bicentennial of Missouri statehood, and many of us tend to think of Missouri's history as a period not lasting more than a few hundred years. Of course, if you've ever visited Europe, no doubt you've seen places that are thousands of years old. One almost viscerally understands the depth of those histories. We don't often think that way about North America, yet these lands were not an uninhabited wilderness. Long before many of my ancestors reached these shores, there was culture and civilization here. People were born, had children, lived and died here in the region we now call home. There is a deep history about the peoples and places that were here before we moved in. To learn something about the Ioway people is a good way to learn something about ourselves, about how we came to live here and who has lived here before, whom many of us have so easily forgotten. After all, for those of us who came later, the New World is only new to us. For these reasons, I'm happy to welcome Greg Olson. Greg is an independent scholar living in Columbia, Missouri, who has been named a Center for Missouri Studies Fellow for 2020. Greg is the author of 6 books about Native American history in Missouri, including our book, The Ioway in Missouri, which is an engaging introduction to the topic and describes the changing fortunes of the Ioway people in the era of exploration, colonialism, and early statehood. That book won the Missouri Humanities Council's Governor's Humanities Award for Distinguished Literary Achievement. His most recent book, Iowa Life, Reservation and Reform, 1837 to 1860, was named a Kansas Notable Book in 2017. Greg is also the author of a forthcoming book with the University of Missouri entitled Indigenous Missouri, Ancient Societies to the Present. Greg is here today to talk about the Ioways' origins, their culture, the role they played in the history of Missouri, and issues that today are yet unresolved. Thanks for being here today, Greg, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Dave. I want to express my thanks to the University of Missouri Press and to the University Libraries. Thank you, Dave and Deb, for the kind introductions. And also thanks to Marie and Robin and everyone else who helped put this talk together. It's a thrill for me to do this for both the press and the library, 2 institutions that I really enjoy. And actually a lot of the research for this book took place in the university libraries. Before I begin, I would just like to also recognize the late Becky Schrader, who was really the force behind this Missouri Heritage Reader Series. It was, I think, her idea, and she led the series for she was the editor for the series for more than 20 years, and I think saw almost 30 books into print. It's a great series, and Becky was the one who really persuaded me that I could write a book. And so I wrote my first book for her and for the press, and I'm proud to have done that. Also, before I get started, I would like to offer my apologies before we get started for anything that I may say that might lead you, the viewers, to misinterpret or misunderstand Ioway culture. I know we have some Ioways who are tuning in today, and it'd be interesting if they had some comments later about different things that maybe we touch on in the talk. But I just want to offer that in the beginning, and we'll get started here. For me, this is where the story started, my awareness of the Ioway. I'm from the state of Iowa. I grew up in Northwest Iowa, up in Buena Vista County. And I am ashamed to say that in the early 90s, probably almost 30 years ago, when I saw this sculpture in Oskaloosa, Iowa, I did not know there was an Ioway tribe. For a long time, I think a lot of people thought the Ioways were extinct, and that happened even as early as the Civil War. I found communications in archives where people from the State Historical Society of Iowa wanted to know who the Ioway were and whatever happened to them, not realizing that Ioways were alive and there all the time. And so I saw this sculpture. Like I said, I first came across it in Oskaloosa, Iowa, probably about 30 years ago. And it's a beautiful piece of art, but it, I think given the time it was put up in 1908, I think it gives people the impression of the inevitability of, it's meant to convey the inevitability of Indian removal. This is an Ioway leader who we'll talk about a little later. His name was Mahuthka. Sometimes he's called Mahaska, or more commonly White Cloud. And you see him, well, there are a lot of inaccuracies, historical inaccuracies in this sculpture. For one thing, Sherry Fry, who was an Iowan by birth, didn't bother to actually go look up any Ioway people to use as models. He drove to Tama, Iowa, and used some Musqueam people for the model of this sculpture. But that aside, if you look at it, you just see he's situated, so he's kind of looking off to the west. Of course, the direction by which the Ioways would be removed, into which the Ioways would be removed. He's got this sort of wistful look on his face. He's holding an eagle feather fan in, I guess that would be his right hand. It's pointed down to the ground. You know, he's got some pride, but he's also got some defeat, and you sense some inevitability. And I think that that was the message that the popular culture was really trying to put across 100, 120 years ago, that the Native Americans were no longer held a place in the nation that they once did, but that was inevitable. And so I got really curious about this. I wanted to know, who is this guy, White Cloud, and who were the Ioways? I mean, when I grew up in Iowa, I think they always told us the word Iowa meant beautiful land, which I guess probably came from the Tourism Bureau. And so I kind of set off on a journey to find out who this guy was and who were the Ioway people. So the word Ioway, there's a lot of debate about a lot of these, but as best as I can tell, the word Ioway comes from the Dakota word Iowuba, and which means sleepy ones. And Ioway was not a name that the Ioways called themselves. This was a name that other tribes, other nations used to refer to them. And there's a story behind the sleepy ones. And the way I've heard the story is that sometimes when Ioways would come to visit, when they were setting up, being entertained by people from other nations visiting, the Ioways would always sort of feign sleepiness early in the evening so they could go off and go to bed or get out of their obligations. That's one story, which may or not be true. Bahoche is what the Ioways called themselves. It's said to mean either gray snow or gray heads. And the way I've heard that story is that one time the Odos came to visit their Ioway relatives, and the Ioways were living in a river valley near a sandbar, and either the sand had blown up and made their lodges dusty, that would be the gray heads, or that the snow had fallen on their lodges and the soot from their fires had made the lodges look gray. So Bahoche is what they call themselves. The Ioways are a Chewere Siouan speaking group, and they are part of a group of 4 nations. They are closely related to the Odos, the Missourias, and the Winnebagos or the Ho-Chunks. And we'll talk about that a little bit more too. All 4 nations speak that same language. And I think about 100 years ago, a guy named James Owen Dorsey figured out that you could trace back ancestry among native people by comparing their languages. This is a piece of art done by my friend Reuben Kent. And I really like this because it, in one image, explains so much about Ioway culture. I'm gonna see if I can get my little laser pointer here. Okay, this is my laser pointer. So it starts in the beginning with this eagle feather. And I've heard people say that in native belief, spirituality, some people believe that the eagle is the only creature from Earth that has ever seen Creator, looked Creator face to face. And so eagle feathers, eagles are important in a number of ceremonial contexts, even to this day. And so that's the kind of the connection. To me, this is the connection between the people and the Creator, the spiritual connection to the other world. Down here we have the cross pipes, and then we've got these 7 dots refer to the 7 clans of the Ioway. And I'm going to have to look this up so that I don't mess it up. But there were sky clans, 4 sky clans that are indicated, of course, up above. And that the sky clans would be the buffalo. It would be, the buffalo, the owl, and the wild pigeon. And then the earth clans would be the bear, the elk, the eagle, and the wolf. And the pipes, too, are also important because they are an instrument, too, that connects common people to the Creator. And it's said that when you light your pipe, that the Creator loves tobacco, loves that smell, and that when he can smell that smell, then they know that the way is open, that humans are trying to express themselves to the Creator. So tobacco opens that door where we can, Ioways or a lot of native tribes can speak directly to the Creator. And then you see a bear claw and a buffalo track, a bear track and a buffalo track. And that symbolizes the fact that the earth clans and the sky clans shared power. This whole design, I really like it because it shows the balance of everything. In all things, there's balance, and that includes governmental power or administrative power. And so traditionally, the Ioways in the fall, the earth clans, which would be led by the buffalo, would administer the tribe through the fall and the winter. And then in the spring, when you'd start to hear the spring peepers, then the buffalo, which would be which were the leaders of the Sky Clan, would rule the tribe. So that's that way, no one got any certain amount of power. Nobody was able to hold power. Imagine today if both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, switched power every 6 months. It was meant to keep everyone in check. And so also then you have this design of Rubens where there's a red side, a blue side, but then there's this yellow in the middle, and that yellow is where we all try to walk in the middle. Not too much one thing, not too much the other. Everything try to keep that balance. I lifted this map from the Osage website because it helps tell one version of the Ioway migration story. So the Osages are part of what's called the Degia Sioux. They speak a Degian Siouan language, which is close to the Chouere Siouan language. I think one way to think about it would be Latin-based languages. So English is a Latin-based language, even though we're not per se Latins. And French, Spanish are Latin languages. They have a lot of commonalities, but they're different. So both those languages came from the Siouan root. And some people would argue, some archaeologists and linguists would argue that the Ioways and then the Degians, the Choueres and the Degians, all started up here south of the Central Great Lakes, sort of on this Ohio-Pennsylvania border. And that about 15 to 1800 years ago, they migrated down the Ohio River to the Mississippi. So the Degians would be the Osages, the Quapaws, the Kansas, the Omahas, and I'm going to forget somebody. But anyway, the Quapaws, when they got to the Mississippi River, immediately kind of separated themselves and went south. And most of the other Osages, they were up here around the Mississippi and Cahokia complex, and the Caws and the Poncas and the Omahas went west. Meanwhile, the Chouere all went up the river, continued up into Wisconsin, and this is the Green Bay area right up here. And that's where their legend takes over. The Chouere claim their beginnings up in this area when they were they were part of the culture that archaeologists today call the Oneota culture. And you see that it's centered. So what we're looking at here is this is the Mississippi River, and this would be the Des Moines River. Keokuk, Iowa would be about right there. There's Keokuk, Iowa right there. This is St. Louis. And then here's the Missouri. So you see Oneota culture was really heavy in Wisconsin and Iowa, but it came down into northern and western Missouri. So for instance, Van Meter State Park up by Marshall was a big Oneota site. There were a lot of archaeological digs and have come up with some stunning Oneota artifacts. The St. Joseph area, King Hill, was an Oneota site. And then even over on the Ioway reservation, which is currently over here, there was the Leary site, which was at one time an Oneota complex. So this is still when the Ioways were together with the Otos, Missourias, and the Ho-Chunks, the Winnebagos. And then I mentioned Green Bay. The Ioway word for that is Mississippian, or Red Earth. And that's really where the Ioways story starts. That's where they begin their story. And I suspect that's because that is the point in time when Ioways sort of found their own identity separate from the other Chouari tribes, separate from the Winnebagos, the Missourias, and the Otos. This map here is an amazing thing. It was drawn by Nohart, who we'll see a little bit later in a picture, in 1837, and it was used as a tool in a treaty negotiation where the Ioways and the Sac and Fox were arguing over who had the right to claim land in Iowa. So what you're seeing here, this to me really illustrates well sort of the conception, the way the Ioways of that time conceived space and transportation and what was important in their world. So this line that goes right up here, this is the Mississippi River, okay? And then this line is the Missouri River. So I am in Columbia, Missouri, so this would probably be the Gasconade River, the Osage River, so I would be about right here. This mark right above me is Van Meter. A lot of people believe that that's Van Meter State Park because here's the Sheraton River and here's the Grand River. Now, each one of these circles with dots in it kind of looks like a chocolate chip cookie. Each of those is a village site. And then you see these little trails that go from village site to village site. And what this map does is it shows 200 years of Ioway migrations. And so that would go back if it was 1837. So we're talking about pre-white contact. We're talking about 1637. And you'll notice that the Ioways showed that they had a presence up the Illinois River. They had a presence going up the Wisconsin River, and they're pretty far north up here. I think this may be, these lines here, or circles rather, may indicate, some people think, the Great Lakes. So it sort of shows their beginnings up at Mississippian, and then you see them going across, this would be southern Minnesota, up into South Dakota a little bit, and then down into Missouri. So they were always moving, always traveling, and along the way, as I say, found their identity as Ioways in a way that was separate. And at the same time, the Missourias were moving down here. The Otos were moving a little farther up the Missouri River, closer into what would be maybe now southeast Nebraska. And then the Winnebagos actually stayed up in Wisconsin. So here you see just a more contemporary map of a lot of that. And it just shows each of these dates means that there was a village in this area at a certain time and point. So you see the Ioways were really moving quite a bit over the 1700s and the 1800s. And that there was a lot of reasons for that. They could have been, I mean, you think about your own street or your own neighborhood where you live. And if you've been there any length of time, just think of how many people have moved in and out of that neighborhood. I mean, people are always moving. Back in the, 200 years ago, I think the Ioways were moving for pretty much the same reasons we do. They're looking for better opportunities, maybe a place where the hunting is better, where it's a little easier to make a living. Maybe the neighbors were a little rough and they wanted to get away a little bit more by themselves. And I think that accounts for a lot of this movement. And they found themselves down here in Missouri, as you can see, around 1800, the late 18th, early 19th century. we'll actually, I've got another map, so we'll talk a little bit more about their presence in Missouri. But you just see that the Ioways, as most nations, were not in any one place. They were always kind of moving. Yeah, here we go. So in Missouri, we consider first European contact to be 1673, because that's when Marquette and Joliet made their way up and down the Mississippi River. And this is what the tribal complexes of Missouri kind of looked like at the time. The Ioways are really just kind of hanging in the north of Missouri. They're not really a Missouri presence so much then, because they're mostly up here in Iowa. There was, before European contact, an Iowa village right here where the Des Moines River meets the Mississippi River, right about, I think there's a Illinois State Park, which is in that area now. And what happened is the Ioways were living there, and then the Illinois Confederacy, which was at that time really powerful, which was a conglomeration of, I don't know, between 8 and a dozen different tribes, pushed the Ioways out up into Iowa. So the Illinois Confederacy is really strong right here. Of course, the Osages are really strong in southwest Missouri, and the Missourias are another powerhouse, and they are centered at that time up around Van Meter State Park. And then just a few years later, in 1803, when the Louisiana Purchase was signed, things had changed quite a bit. You'll notice that the Illinois Confederacy and the Missourias are absent from this map. Both of those powerhouses had been defeated in the ensuing, 130, 140 years between the two maps. The Missourias were decimated in war. A lot of the battles were against the Sac and Fox, but other tribes, they had so much power that other tribes were really, they made a lot of enemies, I guess. And so they lost as much as half of their population over a few years in the 1790s. So they are moving up into Nebraska and Kansas with their Oto relatives. The Illinois Confederacy was also defeated and broken up, partly by the Christianization of people farther east by trade, but also by the Iroquois. The Iroquois were being forced into the West, and that over time did away with the Illinois Confederacy. So that leaves northern Missouri, really kind of free of strong powerhouse nations, and that left room for the Sac and Fox to move down from Wisconsin and Illinois, and it leaves room for the Ioways to move down from Iowa. So let's see here. I wanted to talk just a little bit about living situations and village sites and things. And this is a picture, actually, you can see it's a collage of two pictures that I took probably in 2007 when we visited this site. It's called Iowaville. It's in southeastern Iowa, Van Buren County, Iowa. And it was a village site between 1765 and 1820. And archaeologists think that at one time, it may have had been home to as many as 800 Ioways. So that's a significant amount of time. That's a big town, and it's there in one place for quite a while. Now, that doesn't mean that people were living there constantly, because there would at least be 2 times a year, there would be major hunts. At that time, they were probably still hunting buffalo in the West. So what you're looking at in this picture is we're in the Des Moines River Valley. The Des Moines River is right behind me. And then you see this is the river bottom, and then probably a mile and a half away, you see the river bluff up here. But what's interesting is one of the reasons the Ioways chose this as a site for their Ioway village is because you notice there's a terrace here. There's kind of a crown. You know, we're looking across and there's a farm over there, but we can't see from this vantage point the entire farm. We can just sort of see the top of the barn over there. So it was a terrace, a high spot where even in the most high water years, this area didn't flood. So what you can't see is there's a little stream right over here, which would have been really handy. And then the Des Moines River behind. The terrace keeps them dry. And the river was always, river valleys were always a place where they wanted to have their villages because it was great for transportation. And this was a big fur trading site as well. Archaeologists have found a lot of European artifacts, trade artifacts, and it's an amazing place because even when we were there in 2007, you could still find things on the surface. You know, it gets plowed up, it's private property, it gets farmed. We found a piece of copper, maybe a part of an old kettle or something, just laying on the ground. And then I think 2 or 3 years later, the state of Iowa was able to do kind of a cursory archaeological dig. But you know, other than but this is a site that's never really been studied. It's been gone over by private collectors and things, but it's an amazing place. And this is the kind of lodge, tcakiduthan is that word, the kind of lodge that probably you would have seen in a village like that. So, you know, we're talking, in a way, village is not really the best phrase. We're talking about towns, they're semi-permanent. They're a base where hunters and traders would leave maybe for months at a time and they would come back. There was at this time a lot of exchange between traders and natives, so it's, you know, it's really kind of it's a big town, it's a big village, and there were others. This was not by no means the only Ioway village. So the question that always comes up is then what happened? So the Ioways, all these other native nations were participating in, you know, had the, up until I'd say 1800, had a really vibrant culture. And what happened? And I think that in our in school, we often get the idea that all the natives died in war. You know, that the dispossession of native people from their land happened as a result of battles and war, and that's really only true later when you hear. I mean, it is true off and on over the years. War was, and military defeat was certainly part of it, especially during what I was going to mention were the Dakota Wars and the Plains Indian Wars after the Civil War. But for the Ioway, that was never really the case. The Ioways, some Ioways did fight Americans in the War of 1812, but they were never really defeated in a military way. Instead, I think what happened is the Ioways and some of the other people were defeated in a cultural way. So I've come up with this, you know, I've come up with kind of a three-legged stool. And you have culture, you have environment, and you have economy. I could actually add a fourth leg, which would be spirituality. I guess when I was putting this together, I was thinking that that's part of the culture. But the whole point is all three of these things are interrelated. You can't have one without the other. So before white contact, Ioways were living a sustenance economy, you know, where they would go out and they would hunt, they would trap, what they needed. You know, there was trade going on. We know, archaeologists know that back in the woodland period, you know, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, there was trade, continental trade. But it was, you know, it was more about exotic goods, you know, spiritual, ceremonial goods, things like that. And so one weapon that Americans, or I should say, white European Americans had in combating native tribes was economy. And so by transforming Native people from a sustainable economy where they're hunting and trapping and farming and feeding themselves to a market economy where they're all of a sudden put into a situation where they're exchanging goods, not to have ceremonial objects, but they're exchanging goods to feed themselves. Okay, so, you know, that creates suddenly a burden where the hunters, when they go out, they're not only hunting to feed the nation, they're hunting to kill enough animals so that there are hides for the traders. So now there's more of a burden on the hunters. More people are hunting for a longer time. It's killing more of the animals in the area, the resources. And remember that, you know, traditional natives would have seen animals as relatives. That's why there's bear clans and buffalo clans, because, you know, they see them as relatives. And then that bleeds over, as I guess I mentioned, environment. Suddenly your environment is becoming depleted because you're over hunting. And then that kind of bleeds over into culture in a lot of ways that I think were unanticipated or unexpected. One example is perhaps if you're making pottery, which was traditional for carrying things and preparing meals and things, you know, that whole process of making a pot, you're digging up the earth, which is grandmother earth, you know, the Lakota would call it Unchimaka, grandmother earth. And so there's really a spiritual connection between you digging the clay, you making the clay into a pot, again, related to, you know, spirituality. And when you are no longer making pots, you're buying pots, because let's face it, a metal pot is way better than a clay pot because it's not going to break. You know, you can, you know, that metal pot will last almost forever. So they, you know, they loved European goods, but suddenly you see where this is going is suddenly then their whole culture is kind of devoured by the market economy. And of course, then people come in debt. And way back, in around 1800, Thomas Jefferson figured out that, you know, this market economy thing would be a really good way for Americans to get land from Native people, because he said natives don't have money, but what they do have is land. And if we, you know, if we work this thing right, we can run up their debts. We can force them into indebtedness, and the only way then that they would be able to pay the debt would be to give up land in exchange for the money they owe. Oops. And that gives us to losing land. So this is all of the land that the Ioways ceded in treaty. And as you see, a lot of it was in Missouri or in Iowa, but I want to just kind of focus on Iowa. So notice that the first Ioway Treaty was not until 1824, and yet the state of Missouri became a state in 1821. When Missouri became a state, there were only 2 nations that had ceded any land at all to the United States government. The Sac and Fox, under duress, ceded a small portion of land right here, kind of west of St. Charles. And the Osages in 1808 were persuaded to give up their rights to pretty much all of Missouri, except for a little 20-mile wide slice that was right here. But the Sac and Fox still had claim to a lot of land. The Ioways had claim, the Kickapoos had claim, the Shawnee Delaware had claim. So it really, in a way, the United States sort of preempted all of that when they admitted Missouri into the Union. And in a way, you know, we were an illegal settlement. It could be argued. And so one of the things I've been doing as part of my fellowship with the State Historical Society is going through all of the treaties that were signed, that the United States had to sign with Native tribes to get free and clear title to the state of Missouri. And I think there were 20, I think I counted up 20 or 21 treaties that ceded land, and there were maybe 13 different nations that had to be treated with. And the whole thing wasn't settled until 1837. So this was the first treaty that the Ioways and the Sac and Fox, the land cession that they gave up in 1824. And I don't know if a lot of people may not be aware, but originally Missouri's western border went straight north from Kansas City when we were admitted into the Union. So when this treaty was signed, the Ioways and the Sac and Fox had to go live in this piece of territory over here, and this would be like St. Joseph, Missouri, Platte County, Buchanan County, Atchison County, those counties. And that was kind of an Indian territory. And then after a while, the United States or the state of Missouri started to think, it sure would be nice to have this little piece of land. And I think Thomas Hart Benton, the senator, was quoted as saying it was really no use to the natives because, look at the shape. It's kind of narrow. They can't really do anything with it. So really, and what they wanted was what the U.S. and the Missourians wanted was access to all this river right here. And in fact, St. Joseph, after the treaty was signed, became a big town, and people like Joseph Root made a lot of money. Excuse me. Okay, so quickly, these are two guys who signed that treaty of 1824. Mani Hanye, Great Walker. He also later in his life went by the name Big Neck Tase Hanye. And then this is the guy we talked about earlier, White Cloud, Mahufka. And White Cloud was kind of an assimilationist. He could see that things weren't going so well for the Ioways. So he signed the treaty, gave up the land in northern Missouri, and did his best, to help his people survive this new reality. But Great Walker, when he got back to Missouri, the treaty, by the way, was interesting because the United States government brought these guys to Washington, D.C. to sign this treaty. When Great Walker got back, he was really disappointed. He regretted immediately having done what he'd done. And these are interesting pictures. I could go on a lot. Look at how Great Walker's eyes are kind of downcast, and look at how his face is blackened with ashes from a fire. These are done from paintings that were done when White Cloud and Great Walker were in Washington to sign the treaty. The reason he painted his face black is because, he said he deceived the creator by giving away the land, and, he regretted the fact that a lot of their ancestors were buried on that land. And so while White Cloud went and lived in the Platte country in the Indian Territory, Great Walker and his people moved up into present-day Iowa, where there is still land that the Ioways had not ceded, and he resisted. And this is Mahaska's, White Cloud's wife, Flying Pigeon Woman, and she was a member of the delegation, not as a not participating in the negotiations, but they were given the tour of Washington, and she got to go to some parties. And as you might imagine, the white elite people of Washington, D.C. they found her quite exotic because of her nativeness, and so she was treated like a real star. This is White Cloud's son, Francis White Cloud, and he was one of the signers of this 1836 treaty that gave the Platte Purchase to the United States, and then that area was annexed into Missouri. This is a George Catlin painting of White Cloud, and then this is a sculpture in St. Joseph, and it's kind of interesting, thinking back on that other sculpture of White Cloud's father. This tells a story that is kind of a myth that I'm not sure is true, but there is this story that, again, it has to do with the inevitability of Indian removal. And when Francis White Cloud was confronted with the fact that he was going to have to sign this treaty, story has it that he went and climbed up on one of the high bluffs in St. Joseph, and he prayed prayed for a sign, whether it was okay for him to sign that land away or should he fight. And you notice in his hand here, he's holding some leaves, and those are leaves of the plantain plant. It's not the plantain that you eat that is indigenous to this continent. It's something that grows in everybody's driveway now. You see it. It's a broadleaf plant that has some stems and with the little seed pods on the end. They call it white man's foot. And the reason they called it that is because it was a plant it was an invasive plant that had been brought over by white men. And the lore supposedly is that every time you saw that, you knew that was a place that the white man would be arriving in soon. So as he was praying, White Cloud saw this plantain, and he realized, according to the legend, that it was time for him to sign the treaty again, so sort of softening this whole removal thing and making it seem more inevitable. No Heart is the man, Nachaminye, who made the map that we looked at earlier, and he was also a co-signer. Francis White Cloud was quite young when he became a chief. His father, the first White Cloud, was killed when he was still in his early 50s, I think. And so White Cloud became a leader of the people in his 20s, and No Heart was kind of his advisor. He was a contemporary of the first White Cloud. So in 1836, then, the Ioways were removed from Missouri. After that Platte Purchase was signed, they were removed to a reservation in Kansas that they still have today around the town of White Cloud, Kansas. And that's right near the Kansas-Nebraska border. In the late 1870s, early 1880s, by that time, there were only about 200 Ioways living. And a group of them half of them wanted to move down to what was being created, the Indian Territory. They thought if they moved down there, they could live in a more traditional way. So half the nation went with some of the Sac and Foxes, and they moved down to Oklahoma, and they are still there. They're the Ioways of Oklahoma, near the town of Perkins, Oklahoma, not too far from Stillwater. And so I just wanted to end my talk by showing that Ioways, even though they were evicted or removed from the state of Missouri in the 1830s, they continue, they thrive. They definitely had some rough times, but it seems that in the last quarter century or so, has been a real resurgence of native life, and the Ioways are doing some pretty cool things. Of course, they have the powwow. They express their culture. Both branches of the Ioway Nation have their powwows, annual powwows every year. But they're into other things too. And one of the cool things the Ioways of Oklahoma are doing is they've started this eagle aviary where they will nurse, and treat wounded eagles. Eagles that are hit by cars or maybe are shot, and they can live there. And if they are able to, then they are reintroduced into the wild, back into the wild. And if they are not able to, then they have a place to live out their lives. And then there's also a voter education program, Native Voices Matter. Joyce Big Soldier Miller, an elder down there in Oklahoma. And then the Ioways of Kansas and Nebraska, they're the ones that have the original reservation. They're diversifying. They've got their bee farm. They are now growing hemp, and doing hemp extraction is a new thing, and they've got their CBD oil. One of the really cool things that has just happened here in the last couple of months, and probably is still in the process of happening, is that there is an Ioway Tribal National Park being developed right along the Missouri-Kansas, or rather the Kansas-Nebraska border. What you're looking at here is the Missouri River This is a little town of Rulo, Nebraska. This is the Ioway reservation, and some land that had been donated by the Nature Conservancy has been created as a national park, an Ioway Tribal National Park. Remember, they're a sovereign government. They can do, they can issue their own license plates. They can do on their land, they have the power to do that. They're into, they have businesses. This is the Leary site, which was an Oneota site that I mentioned briefly a little while ago. So they're, both these nations are into historic preservation and all kinds of things like that. So let's see. Well, there we go. It's time for questions. So I put my name down there and my email address if anybody wants to talk to me, get a hold of me. But
thank you so much, Greg. That was fascinating. We're going to bring in Robin now. And Robin is with the University of Missouri Press, and she is going to read the questions out of the chat box.
Thank you so much, Greg. That was such a fascinating talk, and we really appreciate you joining us today for that. The first question I have in the chat box, Greg, is does the Ioway native language survive today, and is it still spoken?
Yes, it does survive. The Ioways, like a lot of other native tribes, very nearly lost their language in the 1990s, and I think that's when the last native or the last people who grew up speaking it passed away. And I think that was a wake-up call for a lot of the different nations. So a lot of people, some people had been making recordings and doing language materials previously, but I think that really stepped up the efforts to do so. So I know both branches of the Ioways are working on language programs, and there really aren't any people who would be what is called native fluent speakers who grew up speaking it anymore. However, it is being preserved, and there are a lot of efforts to especially teach young people to do it.
Well, thanks for that. I'm going to jump ahead one question because one of the attendees is asking if your book is available for purchase. So do you want to move ahead
Sure.
to the next slide so that people can see where they can purchase your book? Greg's book can be purchased with this discount code here on the University of Missouri Press website. That's the homepage is upress.missouri.edu, and you can just search for the Ioway and Missouri in the search box. And if you use this discount code in the when you're checking out holidays 2020, you will receive 40% off the list price of $14.95. So we'll leave that up for a bit so people have a chance to take down any of that information. The next question, let's see. Do you know what the current Ioway population is, Greg?
Let's see. This one's going to get me into trouble. So the northern Ioways, or the Ioways of Kansas and Nebraska, and some of the Ioways that are out there might want to, in chat, help me out with this. But it seems to me that there are maybe 3,000 or 4,000 people on the rolls now that have tribal membership. However, just very few of them live right in the reservation. Most of them are scattered out. I think that the number for the Iowa Tribe of Oklahoma is smaller, but I think it's still 1,000 or so. There is a small blood quantum. Each tribe has their own ability to decide who becomes a member and who does not become a member. And if I understand correctly, the northern Ioways, it's matrilineal. So if your mother puts you on the roll when you're born, or when, if she does that, then without blood quantum, then you are a member. You can be a member then. But I think the southern Iowas, there still is a small blood quantum member, which might account for why their population is a little smaller. And you think about it, it's really kind of a goofy system, because what other ethnicity has to prove their, you know, that they have a certain amount of blood quantum in order to belong to that group. I mean, you think about slavery, there was the 1 drop rule, and as long as you had a one drop of African American blood, you could be held as a slave back in slave times. And actually with natives, it's kind of opposite. You know, you have to prove that you have more than 1 drop of blood. So it's a goofy system, but every tribe has their own rules and their own sovereign control over who is a member.
A couple people jumped in. One attendee says 3,500-ish, and then the next one says, "Oh, I think it's more than that now." And then it's pushing 5,000. I thought maybe that number I heard includes the Southern Ioway.
That could be the 5,000. Yeah, that could be. That would be, yeah. But so anyway, you know, from a group that at one time in 1879 or so was only about 200 people. Yeah, that was, so that they're back. Yeah.
All right, I'll move on to the next question. Let's see. Greg, what was the role of Big Neck's war in the land secession in Missouri, if any?
Well, so when Big Neck left, he refused to stay in the Platte country. And he, like, as I said, he went up into Iowa. And he was not exactly sure where the Iowa border was. So he was actually living in Missouri. He thought he was on Ioway land in Iowa, but he was living about 20 or 30 miles south of the border. And so there was a war where, the so-called war, and where Big Neck confronted some settlers who were living just outside of what's now Kirksville, Missouri. And he told them, "You guys are on our land. You know, we haven't ceded this land. You need to get out of here, or we're going to make you leave, or the federal government's going to make you leave." And things got kind of nasty, you know. And so a posse got together of white people, and they went up to Big Neck's village, and they attacked the village. And I think 3 Ioways died, and 3 or 4 of the militia, the white posse people, died. And so they went to court. Actually, the Ioways were taken to court in what the newly created Randolph County, Missouri, because that was the closest courthouse and to the incident. And believe it or not, this was 1829. The white jury refused to convict Big Neck for killing the white people because the evidence was shown, well, one, that the whites fired first and caused the firefight that killed the people, but also that the Ioways truly believed they were on their own land, even though they were, you know, 20 miles away or something like that. So it's kind of a rare case of justice for the Ioways.
I'm going to break in just a second here and just let you know that we have reached 5 o'clock, but we have more questions in the chat box. We will stay to answer all the questions that are there until, you know, 5:30, or, you know, we can't be here all night. But for those of you who are here, if you do have to go, we'd understand. But I wanted to thank you for coming to our book talk and listening to Greg Olson. Just wanted to give you that thanks to you before any of you do go. So, but feel free to stay if you have time and you'd like to. Some of these questions coming up look really fascinating. So I'm going to turn it back over to Robin and Greg.
Great. There are a lot of great questions coming in. So thank you guys.
Yeah, I apologize for speaking too long in my original talk. Yeah, I should have left more time for questions.
No, that's great. So the next question is, I can't see who the questions are from, so but I'll just, is it Will Clark near the end of his life who negotiates the 1836 treaty? Didn't he do the same sort of land grab to open up the Boonslick soon before Missouri applies for statehood?
William Clark, yeah. He was involved in the Platte Purchase Treaty, the 1836 treaty. And and I'm not exactly sure of the second part of that question, but it might be, the questioner might be referring to the Osage 1808 treaty, and that was the one I briefly mentioned where the Osages gave up their right to almost all of Missouri except for the extreme far western part. And part of the deal there was that the federal government wanted to build Fort Osage, which has been reconstructed as near Sibley, Missouri now. But yeah, I mean, those guys knew that Missouri was destined for statehood, I think, and they were trying to get title, or as the questioner says, land grab to as much land as they could. What kind of prevented it from going farther than it did was the War of 1812. And so that between, 1808 and, the 1820s, the late 18 teens, there were no land treaties because the War of 1812 sort of disrupted and upset the atmosphere in Missouri.
Great, thank you. And the next question, what are the laws about artifacts and human remains, especially on private land? Should these items be returned to tribes?
Yes, they should be returned to tribes. So perhaps people have heard of the NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. I think it's 20 years old now, 30 years old almost. And I know that if bones or artifacts are found on federal land, or if a project is going on with federal money, then those any of those artifacts are susceptible to NAGPRA restrictions. So say there's a dig on private land, but the federal government, say the Corps of Engineers or somebody pays for it, then those artifacts are still fall under the NAGPRA Protection Act. And that says that artifacts, if that there's a complicated system for figuring out in what tribes have jurisdiction or rights over which locations, but those tribes have to be called in and be informed about that. Now, I think if you are just on private land doing private things with private money, I don't think that there's any teeth to the law, but that doesn't make it right. Yeah. And a lot of museums too that have collections are, they're going through this process and they're consulting. I think what the best thing that's happened as a result of NAGPRA is that federal construction projects, road projects, things like that, they're more likely to consult with Native tribes in that process. So the communication is starting to get a little better. Native people are being included in decision making, or at least being informed and consulted over that. So yeah, it's not a perfect system, but it really has helped communicate. So it's not just about repatriating artifacts and things, although that's a big part of it.
Okay, thanks for answering that. Our next question from our next attendee wants to know, is there any relationship between the site of Cahokia in Collinsville and the Ioways?
Yeah, I meant to kind of mention that. So you remember when I showed that map of the Oneota culture that was up in Iowa, Wisconsin, and northern and western Missouri. And that was contemporary with Cahokia. Cahokia people were called Mississippians. And so the two cultures, and there's a lot of mystery about exactly what was going on there, that they were contemporaries. There's some evidence of connection between the Oneotas and then the Mississippians at Cahokia, but it's not really understood how close they were. And one thing I've been reading about in the research I'm doing for this next book and trying to figure out is the Osages, who the other Siouan, the Degia Siouan group. Some people claim the Osages were part of Cahokia. Some people claim the Osages were Oneota. So there's a real gray area there, but I think we could safely say that the Ioway people were not part of the Cahokia population. They may have had some contact, but they weren't really core to that.
Okay. The next question, one of the attendees wants to know was, what's been the reception of your book by the Ioway tribe? Has there been any negative, any positive? Have you learned more? Have people written to you to tell you other things that they thought you should cover, or?
Yeah, well, this book's been out a while now, and it's opened a lot of doors for me, and it's given me the opportunity to meet a lot of Ioway people. And so one of the reasons why I keep working on books that have predominantly to do with Ioways, or in the case of my next one, Missouri tribes, is, you get to know people, doors open, you get to hear more stories, you spend more time. I mean, it's, I'm sure not everybody likes necessarily what I'm doing. This book in particular, the Ioway and Missouri, I didn't really see myself as writing that book for Ioways. I mean, I figure Ioways, a lot of them anyway, know their own history. I mean, if they find the book informative and helpful, that's great. I really love it. But I wanted to put something out there mostly for the non-native population, because there's so much misinformation, and I think we as non-natives just have such funny ideas about native populations that was my primary reason for wanting to do this book, was to just give some information, some concrete information to maybe help those of us who aren't native understand the place of people like Iowa in our history.
Yeah, it's kind of an introductory book. I think,
yeah.
Which this series was sort of made to be
right.
An intro. Let's see what's next. Let's see, Dave answered the question about your latest book and where it was published. Iowa Life, Reservation, and Reform, 1837 to 1860. Published by the University of Oklahoma Press. Let's see. Okay, is the rivers map you showed supposed to be a point in time, or was it villages shown over time?
Oh, I assume they're talking about the map that has all of the different village sites, the date, and that's over time. So it would include probably it would go from about 1680, which is about the time that the Ioways first encountered white people, up until the time they moved into Missouri, which would be about 1800.
All right, more questions are coming in. Thank you, guys. This is great. Greg, you're not going anywhere, not yet.
I'm glad to stay.
One of the attendees says, I can't speak for the tribe, but I think it is well written, easy to read, and well researched. So that's great. Another attendee asks, let's see. As an Iowa person, I will say I've learned a lot about my heritage through books, including some of yours, because so much of our history, culture, and traditions have been lost. We need resources like this to recover it. So I apologize. I cannot pronounce these next two words. Wena Wahina Ki.
Wadagrohike.
Thank you so much.
Wadagrohiki.
Thank you.
That's thank you.
Thank you.
Is what that
thank
is.
You for the work you do.
Well, thank you. Wadagrohike.
Okay, so it looks like the questions have been winding down, and it was wonderful to have this question section, this back and forth, and to hear some of the fascinating questions and answers that have been shared here. So I just want to thank everyone once again for attending. Thank you very much, Greg, for giving this presentation, and to our partners, University of Missouri Press, for going in with us, the University of Missouri Libraries, on this event. We hope to get together again in late January for our next book talk. So watch your emails for announcements and have a wonderful evening.